But before its complete demise, the National Union formed the Armenian Press Bureau in New York and asked Vahan Kardashian to head it. Kardashian, I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about him. He was born in what we call Gesaria, and he attended American missionary and French Jesuit schools, came to the United States, actually married a wealthy American socialite, and through her connections he actually got into Yale University. He became an outstanding student, and he became a lawyer, opened a law practice in New York City, and started making a lot of money. He also made a lot of political connections at this time. Interestingly enough, from 1911 to 1915, Kardashian was also the attorney for the Turkish consulate in New York and the Turkish embassy in Washington, D.C. This wasn't so unusual because at the time, many Armenians, of course, worked in the service of the Ottoman Empire. But in this capacity, he met a lot of American politicians, religious figures, prominent individuals, and he was the High Commissioner for the Turkish exhibit at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, where he met numerous American political figures like William Jennings Bryan and others. Now, the genocide in 1915 led Kardashian to completely sever all of his ties with the Turks, and he became an avowed Turkophobe and then a ceaseless supporter of the Armenian cause. I believe I can't prove it, but I think his passion, his vehemence, were the result of, I think, a kind of a deep guilt feeling that he had when the genocide occurred, because here he was, in Washington, in this official capacity as attorney for the Turkish embassy, but his own mother and sister actually perished in the genocide. And I think he never probably got over that fact. And so there was there's a real passion and vitriolic sort of sentiment that you can see in Kardashian's writings. Anyway, Kardashian, as head of the Armenian Press Bureau, then came to realize that the National Union was incapable of doing the necessary political work to achieve and sustain Armenian independence. He also had personality clashes with the head of the Armenian National Union, whose name was Miran Sevasli. And he said to other people that he felt Sevasli was an ineffective leader. So Kardashian and his associates with the Armenian Press Bureau, which was actually based in New York at the time, began to think about creating a new organization. And I think the reasons for this new organization were threefold. One was the Allies, including the United States, despite all of its comments about creating or helping the Armenians after the terrible massacres that took place in 1915, were actually vague about what would be the actual post-war settlement for Armenia. And even President Wilson's 14 points only mentions non-Turks should have the, quote, an unmolested opportunity for autonomous development. But that's a lot of words, and what does that actually mean? That was a big question mark. And Henry White of the U.S. Peace Mission, that's the group that went with Wilson to the Versailles Peace Conference, responded in a letter to Kardashian that, quote, it is impossible for me to say whether Armenian independence will be attained or not at the approaching conference. And then two, the Allies had secretly actually divided up the Ottoman Empire among themselves in secret treaties. There was a London Agreement of 1915 and the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which actually divided the Arab lands between the British and the French, but divided the Armenian territories on the Armenian plateau between the Russians and the French. And Kardashian was very strongly anti-imperialistic, so he was very concerned about that the Allies were actually going to partake in the spoils and not deliver Armenian independence or sustain Armenian independence. And three, many of the American missionaries supported an American mandate, a trusteeship for the whole of Anatolia. That's because their missions were spread throughout, not just for Armenia alone. And for Kardashian, this in his mind, would put the Armenian population at risk, because eventually it would build up the Turkish nation, and then in his mind, they would then embark on another genocidal campaign. Now, there were a number of sympathetic American politicians during this period, particularly Henry Cabot Lodge, who was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Lodge actually sponsored a Senate resolution in early December 1918 calling for the independence of all of Armenia, all of Armenian historical lands. And this actually passed the Senate. And Lodge became an executive member of the American Committee for the Independence of Armenia. Kardashian and his associates then began to organize the ACIA, as I'll call it now. They held a large banquet in New York City in February 1919. Many prominent American officials attended. The keynote speaker was the former Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Members of the Wilson administration were at this banquet. And Charles Evans Hughes had this quote at this banquet. He said, "There is no doubt about the capacity of the Armenians for freedom. They are capable as any people. They have a racial solidarity and a capacity to survive incredible misfortune. They have rare intelligence, and no people prize more highly the advantages of education. We propose tonight to throw such influence as we have into the scale for Armenian independence." So that was the sentiment of the time and of these prominent American officials. Now the ACIA favored either a mandate for Armenia alone or direct U.S. aid to Armenia without a mandate. This would be military aid, munitions, supplies, economic aid, and perhaps American soldiers. And up through the summer of 1919, it appeared that there was strong American public support for a mandate for Armenia. In fact, the editorials of the New York Times supported this concept, as did other American newspapers. However, the idea of assistance to Armenia got bogged down and ultimately became a victim of American politics. Wilson's top priority was the League of Nations. Wilson believed that the question of a mandate should be deferred until the Senate approved the Versailles Treaty with the League of Nations covenant. And Wilson also believed he could not unilaterally send U.S. troops to Armenia without congressional authorization. Now here we have this kind of American political dance in the American political system, where Henry Cabot Lodge tells Kardashian and Girard that only the president has the authority to send troops to Armenia. On August 8th, Henry Cabot Lodge wrote to James Girard, who was the executive of this ACIA and a former U.S. ambassador to Germany, that in response to the massacres of the Armenians, quote, "I feel as you do about the necessity of aid to Armenia. It is a frightful thing, it is a frightful tragedy what is going on there. But there is nothing on earth Congress can do. It is an executive matter. We cannot order troops. We are not in control of the peace conference." But Woodrow Wilson believed only Congress had the authority to authorize troops. So they were playing a kind of a political game with each other on who would actually send troops to Armenia, or if they could. Finally, a month later, in September of 1919, Woodrow Wilson's friend, John Sharp Williams, a Democratic senator from Mississippi, and was also an executive member of the lobby group, the ACIA, introduced a resolution subsequently called the Williams Resolution that would allow the president to send troops to Armenia and to suspend the Foreign Enlistment Act to allow Armenian-Americans to join the Armenian army. However, Henry Cabot Lodge sent the resolution to a subcommittee chaired by Warren Harding, who was a Republican senator from Ohio at the time, and also Harry New, a Republican senator from Indiana. And when they sent it to the subcommittee, it sat there for months. And Lodge confided in his friend Elihu Root, a former senator from New York, but who was also an executive member of the ACIA, that, quote, "Wilson is, quote, an utterly treacherous and sinister figure. Armenia is a tragedy, but I do not believe you could get the American Congress to send troops there.